Good morning, everyone. To be honest, it's been a tough week. Watching the news, again hearing of the goings-on in the world around us, internationally and locally, has caused me to better understand the despair of Jesus, who, when at the beginning of what we know as the Palm Sunday story, as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. We hear his utter dismay also in the words found in Luke 13. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often have I longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. You were not willing, you don't understand, you still don't get it. If we did not know it before, we are coming to understand it now. This is a suffering world, and so much suffering is about power. A quote usually attributed to Jimi Hendrix is that when the power of love is stronger than the love of power, we will know peace. The love of power, the compulsive need to control another, is strong. We see it far too often, in the world, in the workplace, in the church, in families. We see it everywhere. There's a saying that goes, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is all too often true. And the unfortunate thing is, too often those abusing their power do not themselves recognize the roots of what is going on, that perhaps they are needing to control out of their own low self-esteem, and they do not recognize the impact their exertion of power has on the more vulnerable. They might even have convinced themselves that what they are doing is the right way to go. This may be particularly true with religious power because religious beliefs tend to run deep. Although I know war is complex, I found it interesting but mostly disturbing to read a recent online article called "The Best of Christian Compassion, the Worst of Religious Power," which explains how violence can stem from a misguided sense of religious mission. In a fairly recent article in the Canadian Mennonite called "What Peacemakers Need to Understand About Power," Kimberly Penner reminds us that during the Radical Reformation, early Anabaptists rejected abuses of power by church leaders in positions of authority, as well as a close relationship between church and state, unquote. She notes that we have interpreted Jesus' death on the cross as a sign of powerlessness and submission, and taken that to mean that we should be powerless and submissive as well. In a related article, Gelassenheit and Power, written by Susie Gunther Lowen, she says that in our churches, using Jesus' model of emptying himself and taking on the form of a slave, we have taken on the ideal of servanthood, of utter humility, which makes people more vulnerable to hierarchical, dominating, and violent power in many settings, I would add, including our homes and churches. Penner maintains that if we do not work toward understanding power and how it works for good and bad, then we are in danger of perpetuating the abuse of it. She gives the example of how white settlers exerted control over Indigenous children and their parents in residential schools. Yes, even through our own Mennonite church. Sexual violence, which is an abuse of power, is a prime example of what can go wrong when we don't understand power because we don't talk about it. When we don't talk about it, we don't always recognize the presence even of power or its close relative, privilege. When my granddaughter was 6 months old, she was enrolled in swimming lessons, if you can call it that, a parent and baby group. Of course, I was there watching and delighting in this new experience of her being in the pool as a baby. And of course, I brought my camera, taking pictures and even videos. At the end of the lesson, I realized that there was a sign saying no cameras were allowed in the pool area. I knew that made sense, But even though I understood the reason for the rule, and I took pictures only of her and no other babies, I reasoned that no one would question a grandma taking pictures of their grandchild, and no one did. By contrast, my single son and I watched my grandson taking swimming lessons at the Y in Winnipeg. I went right into the pool area and sat on the side, again taking my camera. Since my son arrived at the pool a little later, he watched from the walkway running above it. Although I had felt completely at ease, he later said that he had felt quite uncomfortable, knowing he could be perceived as watching these kids in the pool for the wrong reasons. Since learning about power and the different kinds of power, I understand that what I had as a white grandmother was privilege, a social or identity-based power that not everyone has. Even with a different skin color, I could well not achieve the power and privilege that I seemed to have those days at the pool. Power is the ability to effect change. Basically, the ability to get other people to do what you want, or let you do what you want. I dare say most of us would rather feel we have power than to feel powerless. So let's have a look at power and explore some different types. Some people have personal or charisma power which affords them uncritical loyalty of their followers. This is a subjective power based on the perception that some people are, in some way, exceptional. Role power, or status power, is a master status, and what I learned in a workshop about boundaries a couple of years ago was that pastors are often master statused, and that this power differential is important to recognize. Pastors are often granted a type of blanket authority by their congregants. In comparison, there is greater vulnerability of the congregant and potential for abuse. In that workshop, I learned about what they called the rules of the sea as related to the concept of power, meaning that because a power boat has power and control of movement, it's obligated to avoid boats under sail, and therefore has the burden of responsibility. In contrast, a sailboat is at the mercy of the wind and less in control of its movement. It's vulnerable to powerboats, and therefore it has the privilege of being protected. It is responsible then, or the responsibility then, of the speedboat to watch for the slower moving sailboat, meaning it is the responsibility of anyone with more power to be mindful of those with less. I can't say I'm big on superheroes, but on the wall of my grandson's room, there hangs a Superman poster that says, "With great power comes great responsibility." It's a good message, and not only for kids. I wish all the grown-ups of the world understood that concept. Power is present in every relationship and context in which we find ourselves. Historically, and even today, men tend to have more power than women. Sometimes younger people feel that they have less power. Certainly whites have more power than people of color, and the rich have more power than the wealth. Our society, or than the poor, I should say. The rich have more power than the poor. Our society is known not to worship not only wealth, but celebrity and physical beauty. For all of us, whatever context we happen to find ourselves in, we need to be aware of power differentials. Even those who are parents need to consider the power they have over their children, and it is considerable. I think a lot of our awareness of power is subconscious. Even our efforts to gain power can be subconscious. Sometimes it is intentional, as when two government parties join forces when voting. But I expect most of us do it without even being aware of what we are doing. When Tim Nicol came to speak to church council and pastoral team to teach us about conflict and how it works, I learned that sometimes conflict escalates, in part because we tend to gather together and look for support for our own point of view. He said that we often try to gain power by drawing like-minded people around us. I get that. I've been there. The other day I took part in a workshop based in England. Oh, the wonder of technology. It was a workshop about being the church in what they called a sexular age. I truly think they made up the word sexular, but it's easy to understand its meaning. At any rate, at the workshop, someone said, "We need to listen to a variety of opinions. We're not going to grow if we only talk to our own reflection." So it's important to be willing to look at things through another lens, find common ground, accept what's not in common, and in dialogue to put aside the need to be right or to forcibly convince the other. Also, sometimes we need to accept that there will be unfinished business, incomplete resolution, and be okay to sit with that, at least for a while, and maybe a long while. So back to power. Or maybe I haven't gotten that far off base. Our focus statement for today is, as we seek God's way, we move from an understanding of power that grasps for control over others to an understanding that true power comes from working with and for others in love. I find it curious that today, on Palm Sunday, the focus is not so much on the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem with palm branches waving and loud hosannas being sung. The Lenten resources for the Mennonite Church do not really go there. Instead, they include the passage from Philippians, which we heard earlier, and they include Psalm 31. I expect as Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem, knowing full well that there were death plots against him, he will have resonated with this psalm. Maybe in our current experience of life in this world, we do too. Let me read it for you. "Now take pity on me, Yahweh, for I'm in trouble again. I cried so much that I'm exhausted, and not only my eyes, but my mind and body as well. My life is consumed by sorrow. My years are worn out with my sighs. My strength fails me because of my despair. My bones are getting weaker. I am forgotten, as good as dead in their hearts, like something that has outlived its usefulness. I hear their endless slanders and threats from every quarter as they conspire against me, plotting to take my life." I expect as Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem on that Palm Sunday, but more significantly entered what he knew would be the final week of his life. Troubling and distressing thoughts will have been rolling around in his mind. Thoughts about the coming suffering which he was, in fact, powerless in humanness to change. He knew how this was going to go. For Jesus, it involved the temptation to avoid suffering, the loss of dignity as he is stripped and beaten and mocked, the suffering as he drags his own cross, falling 3 times, the nailing of hands and feet, the parching dry thirst, and then the utter loneliness and despair of feeling forsaken by his God. This is the epitome of powerlessness. Yet, this is what Jesus chose. In Philippians, we read that despite his equal status with God, he did not cling to the advantage of that status. Instead, Jesus emptied himself, made himself nothing, and took on the status and image of oppressed humankind. When I think about it, that choice is really quite incomprehensible, because we've become so well aware that this can be a nasty world. Jesus knew that. Our forebears knew that. But our generation in this part of the world has largely been removed from the suffering that many others have known all too well for a long time. Obviously, I can't tell where you're at, like literally. You may all have walked out by now for all I can tell. But maybe you're still here, which would indicate that the preacher holds a certain amount of power, even in absentia, even when that preacher seems to articulate a whole lot of bad news. So where is the good news in all this? The good news is that with God, there is always good news. When Jesus entered into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, his method of transportation was no accident. A donkey is not known as a regal creature, nor as a powerful one. A donkey is not a speedy animal. Jesus the King, riding on a donkey, exemplifies a compassionate, humble power quite different from what the world tends to worship. The donkey itself seems quite insignificant, yet it was empowered by Jesus, chosen to humbly serve him. In choosing to ride on a donkey, Jesus transformed our understanding of power. As Susie Gunther Lowen says, it wasn't primarily about giving up power, but about transforming how power is understood in the first place, into the power of mutual empowerment, or of sharing power and building each other up, especially the least among us. She explains, this is sometimes called the power of solidarity and compassion, or the power of peacemaking, unquote. Jesus modeled it well. This is what God does. Out of God's desire, God empowers us as humans to be God's agents of reconciliation in the world. We have all been given agency, or the ability to act in ethical ways, the ability to make positive choices, wise choices, because of the power with which God has gifted us. But again, this power is not how the world knows it. Rather, Jesus' power involves an awareness of those who have less power in order to lift them up, to empower them. Jesus demonstrated relationships of power with rather than power over others. One example given in the Gelassenheit Power article is the healing of the hemorrhaging woman, where he empowers this formerly invisible woman and affirms her faith and courage, building her up by telling her that it was her faith, not his own power, that saved her. Many times Jesus demonstrated what it meant to make the mountains low and raise up the valleys, what it meant to make the rough places plain. He lifted the lowly and held to accountability those with greater privilege. Jesus used his power not by forcibly pushing his agenda, but by showing people such great love that they couldn't resist. Jesus showed us that it's the very nature of God to be self-giving, other-affirming, and community-creating. That's it right there. I think that's it in a nutshell. And this is where we come in. If God can be that for us, then we too can be self-giving, other-affirming, and community-creating for God. Earlier I said with great power comes great responsibility. One of those responsibilities is the intent, like Jesus, to empower others. There are so many ways that this can be done. While driving home from work one afternoon, I heard about the power of words in an interview with Zoe Roy on CBC Radio. Originally from the Peter Ballantine First Nation, she is a poet and community-based educator here in Saskatoon who teaches all children that they matter, that they are important, that they belong. She says if children believe that, then what they can do with their life is endless. The writer of the article says, you'll find out that in her soft and humble offstage demeanor, quite quickly translates into onstage power and emotion. Zoe Roy uses her voice, her own power, to empower kids to confront bullies, and she inspires hope with her message and her poetry writing tools. Can we too find a way to empower the powerless? Sometimes we need to be intentional about relinquishing some of our own power in order to share some of that power with others. I recall playing a circle game called Up and Down the Mississippi. You may know it. Played it a few years ago, and I suddenly realized to my utter chagrin that my knees would no longer allow me to do that sideways skipping sort of move that's required to move up and down the line. Funny thing, my partner in that game suddenly couldn't do the move either, although I know for a fact that she was biking to work and in much better shape than I was. I have observed that for her it seems natural to move away from a position of having more power and into the position of those with less. I have another friend whom I've seen being intentional about relinquishing power. Before I tell you about her, I will tell you that my mother made sure we went shopping for new outfits before I started working at City Hospital. Granted, having just graduated, that may have been necessary. But I'm embarrassed to admit that what we bought were nice, dressy clothes we thought fitting for a chaplain. In contrast, this friend, working in St. Paul's Hospital, dressed every day in casual pants and a t-shirt with a sweater over. A t-shirt. I thought that was just her style until she mentioned something one day about buying a couple of fascinators in a little shop she found here in the city. You may recall that a fascinator is a high society headpiece that is often worn by women at weddings and other events in the UK. Now, this didn't at all fit my impression of this friend, whom I had seen only in t-shirts and casual pants. Not at all, until I realized that she was intentionally dressing down for work in order to bring herself to fit in better with some of the patients with whom she worked. She was intentionally relinquishing some of her power to better identify with people who may have felt that they had less. This woman did not flaunt her power, but intentionally lowered herself and met the world humbly. We can use our power in Jesus' following ways to edify others. Somehow that interesting word edify just tends to catch my attention. It's found in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 11. And while it's not a big, impressive word, it's a powerful word. It is translated in more recent translations using the phrase, build each other up. The whole verse being, so then encourage one another and build each other up, just as you are doing. To edify or to build each other up is to empower another. How do we do that, especially for those who are marginalized? Can we open our hearts to speak a kind and encouraging word to all? Can we make it our intent to always build the other up? Trusting in God's grace brings freedom from fear and fills our heart with loving response. In Psalm 31, the psalmist is able to move to that point when he says, but I put my trust in you, Yahweh. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. Save me from the hands of my enemies and persecutors. Smile on your faithful one. Save me in your love. As we look into the future and consider the abuse of power, the hatred and fear in it, in the world at large, but as I've said, sometimes even within our own families and in our churches, I think more than ever we need hearts filled with the assurance of God's love for us. Freedom is an opening of the heart away from the constructs of hatred and anger which seem often to be based in fear. It is the freedom to love without limitations and exclusions. And we love because God first loved us. Our church's inclusion statement reads in part, with God's help, we will not discriminate in regard to race, ethnic background, age, gender identity, sexual orientation, income, education, ability, and other factors that may give rise to division and marginalization. In short, we believe God's love, Jesus' love, is for all, ourselves included. Love is, once more, the answer. I want to close with a quote from The Voice, a fairly new translation of the New Testament, which says of Philippians chapter 2, imagine the kind of church Paul describes, a community where every person considers the needs of others first and does nothing from selfishness, a group that pulls together rather than pulls apart, and a body that knows its purpose and lets nothing interfere with it. It would be the kind of spiritual family where others would want to belong, Outsiders would line up to become part of the sacred assembly and to make it their home, because they see the welcome, feel the encouragement, and know they are truly loved. So Paul urges the Philippians to strive for this radical unity and fulfill his joy by having the mind of the liberating King. That mind is beautifully expressed as Paul retells the story of how Jesus humbled himself, became a servant, and suffered the death of the cross. Jesus becomes the lordly example of humility and service, leading to the kind of unity that Paul imagines." Unquote. May we, by the grace of God, take heart and strive to become self-giving, other-affirming, and community-creating followers of Jesus Christ. May we always keep in mind the image of the speedboat and the sailboat, and building up those who are less powerful than ourselves, remembering that Christ-like power comes from working with and for others in love. Amen.